Hi, and welcome to the newest episode of the Steeple Report. Today we have on Robin Gauthier, I hope I pronounced that properly,
You did?
from the Samaritan House in Virginia Beach. Welcome to the Steeple Report, Robin.
Thank you for having me.
Great. As I usually do, why don't I throw it to you to give us a little background about yourself and your backstory and how you arrived to where you are today.
Sure. So I've been at Samaritan House for 20 years now. I started out as a student intern, which is always an interesting story. I went to Norfolk State University to get my degree in social work, and so my practicum was here at Samaritan House, and I stayed 2 semesters. And so I've had a lot of different job responsibilities since I've been here, risen up through the ranks, and now I'm the executive director and have been since July of 2016.
Wow, that is interesting, especially in this day and age where you just don't see people staying in the same place all that long.
Absolutely. But I've been challenged for every position. And I'm still challenged now. So as long as I remain professionally challenged, I love working with victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So I'm in a good spot.
Well, you are, and such important topics require people that have a tremendous amount of background and knowledge, because I'm sure that as those various things develop, people come into it with new ideas and always wanting to try something new. So you probably, I'm guessing, lend some consistency and what they call internet intellectual history, if you will, that
Yeah.
that you've seen what's worked and what's failed, and so you can lend some
Yeah.
expertise to that and say, well, we tried that 10 years ago and this is what happened.
Yeah. Institutional knowledge is always
That's the
helpful.
term I was trying
Um,
to come up with. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I can probably answer just about every possible question most people can ask, which is really helpful when you're out fundraising, you're out talking to groups, because I've been around for so long. So yeah, so for the most part, it's really helpful to have someone with that institutional knowledge and experience, and it's been a win-win so far.
I would also think that having a familiar face consistently over a number of years helps the institution, but also helps those that wish to assist the institution, be that fundraising and volunteerism, et cetera. By knowing there's a steady hand at the helm, I'm sure that lends some confidence to the people that are involved with the Samaritan
That's
House.
true. Yeah, I've heard that on more than one occasion. Yes, it's absolutely true.
Yeah. So why don't you maybe give us a little history about the Samaritan House and how it got started and kind of its evolution?
Sure. So, back in 1983, there was no homeless shelter in the city of Virginia Beach. And so many church leadership got together, and it was called Ecumenical Housing Incorporated. There was a group of church leaders, about 10 of them, got together and started the first 501c3 known as Samaritan House today. And what they decided was there was just so much pressure from Department of Social Services saying to folks in the city of Virginia Beach, there's no homeless services and no shelter, and can someone do something about that? And so that's when Samaritan House was born in 1983, and we became incorporated in 1984 and started seeing that there were so many victims of violence that were coming to our emergency shelter that we started doing our work with victims of domestic violence as well. So that's how it kind of evolutionized into working with victims of domestic violence. And then again, back in 2016, we retooled ourselves again to also include working with victims of human trafficking. The Office of the Attorney General contacted me and said, we've been seeing an uptick in human trafficking in Hampton Roads. Would you be willing to take this on and help out by helping with a human trafficking task force and growing your program again to take on another population. And so we did. So that's, one thing that's great about nonprofits is we can retool ourselves and fill in the gaps of what's needed in the community. So that's sort of the evolution from working with homeless families to victims of violence and then now victims of human trafficking. And we still work with all three groups of vulnerable people.
The fact that we have to even talk about these subjects is disturbing enough. But the work you're doing, is so necessary, but also can really change individuals' lives. And without a place to go and a place for support and a place, with a roof over their head, it changes the whole discussion. I mean, just to give us an idea of like size and scope. So you had kind of three different verticals there. You had the homeless, and you had the domestic abuse and the human trafficking. Could you maybe kind of give us an idea of, what kind of size and scope we're talking about in those individual areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So on an annual basis, we're assisting about 300 people in our emergency shelters, and it can be for any one of those reasons: domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. We don't take as many folks in our emergency shelters for homelessness because the Witch Duck area homeless resource center opened up 3 years ago. And so they're serving all the homeless families in the city of Virginia Beach. And so for our homeless population, we end up rapidly rehousing all of those homeless families from the homeless resource center with our rapid rehousing program. And so we're assisting about 200 families a year that come either from our own stock of emergency shelter or from the community, like the homeless resource center. We're doing that rapid rehousing piece and housing them. And then with our victims of violence, same thing. They're coming into our emergency shelter, which is available 24/7, 365 days a year, because you don't know when violence is going to occur. And so when violence occurs in the home, sometimes the police are called, sometimes the police aren't. So we're available 24/7. We provide that emergency shelter and comprehensive services for folks in the community that are living with domestic violence. And so about 300 to 500 people that are victims of domestic violence that are going to court also use our community services. So besides our shelter, our comprehensive services include services in the community. So we have victim advocates, 3 actually, that assist folks that are either at the police station and want to file a report. We work in the Detective Bureau. We also have someone at the court, Juvenile Domestic Relations Court, that assists people with protective orders. And then we also have someone here who's always eligible and ready to talk on our hotline if someone who's on our hotline calls and they really want to talk to a victim advocate about doing some safety planning and get other resources in the community. Whether or not they want shelter, they still can have all those comprehensive services here. So then in the human trafficking side, we're still assisting anywhere from 50 to 60 people a year. It's been a little over 200 people since we started in 2017. The task force was really inaugurated, and they started doing trafficking rescues with tips from the tip line. And so that started around 2017, and we're constantly getting 8 to 10 people every quarter, about 40, 50, 60 people a year in that program, kind of depending on what's going on and how many investigations that the task force is doing and how many operations they're running. So it kind of depends on the ebb and flow of that. But we have had over 200 victims and secondary victims since the inauguration of the task force and our services in 2017. And so,
how do you define a secondary victim? I'm not sure.
So if a victim of human trafficking comes into our program and say they could be pregnant and they have a baby, or they could have a child with them, Or there could be a child who is maybe with another relative or in foster care, and that child comes into care with them. Those are secondary victims, we call. So they were not a victim of the trafficking themselves, but
Okay.
we're still serving them with our services. So we're serving lots of children of victims, and then also minors as well, who are primary victims.
So, taking a step back to the victims of domestic violence, um, in the last year or so with COVID, we hear a lot of statistics being thrown around,
Oh,
but one of
yes.
them we hear is that because of the um, more stay-at-home order or what have you, the closer quarters, that domestic violence has had a big uptick.
Uptick.
Have you experienced that?
Yeah, Richard, we really have. Prior to last year, what I typically do is budget about 30,000 a year for hotels and motels, because when we run out of space in our shelters and someone's in imminent danger, we'll go ahead and put them in a hotel until space opens up. Well, typically we spend about 29, 30,000, and the year before last we spent 29,000 and change. This year we have spent 158,000 already, and that fiscal year isn't up. So we had a huge increase of people needing our emergency shelter, which we have not had prior to the pandemic, like this. And so there's just a lot more people when they're at home, stay-at-home orders, and or people that have lost employment. Now the family stress is extremely high. People are at home because they're either quarantining or because they don't have jobs or anything, all the things that are contributing to the pandemic. Now there's more people that are calling, assisting victims of domestic violence because they're hearing the arguments at home and the screaming and the yelling and the abuse occurring. So you have a lot more police being called out. And when the police are called out, they're automatically giving them our information and even contacting us immediately on the scene saying there's a victim here who may need your assistance. Please talk to her. It's called a lethality assessment protocol that's happening in the city of Virginia Beach. And we're really proud that our police officers are trained to do this protocol. And so they're speaking to us directly and we're saying, hey, do you need help? And so we're getting, a demand for our emergency shelter and more people coming in, really based, we can really pin it down to the pandemic and all the things happening due to that. So that's an absolute yes. Between the uptick in calls that we're getting, the uptick in people that are going to court, but really that uptick of the hotel motels that we're spending our funding on. So I'm just thankful for the community support and a lot of grantors and grantors that are offering money for COVID relief has really helped, like Bank of America and some folks that gave us extra money for the COVID relief has really contributed to helping us use those hotels, motels when people are in imminent danger and we don't have space.
The interesting thing that I saw, and it kind of connected all three of those verticals, kind of leads me to the discussion of human trafficking, where I heard someone, an expert in the field, talking about how victims tend to be disproportionately coming out of, quote unquote, the system, the foster system or what have you, and that kids that are in unstable households also tend to be targets for those that would traffic.
Yeah.
So that got me thinking about, not only the homelessness, but the domestic violence, because that can lead to the instability.
Yes.
And then there's the human trafficking that might result from those.
Yes. Yes. It's very unfortunate that we are seeing an uptick since the pandemic in familial trafficking. So more families are trafficking their children and youth because it's a way to earn income. So, families are really suffering out there and financially aren't able to make it. And so one of the unfortunate, things that have occurred is the uptick in human trafficking. And children are being trafficked now more than ever, which is devastating. But we're just so thankful that we're here and we're able to provide some of those services for the youth. We have a case manager that works directly with children and youth of trafficking. And, some are in foster care, some have run away from foster care, some are in homes, some have left their homes and run away because of things happening. And some are in juvenile detention because there's just no place to put them. And so I'm thankful that we've had services to provide with our case manager and our medical and therapy and things like that. But that has really led us to identify one of our biggest gaps here at Samaritan House and in the community, in the region, and in the state, to be honest with you, is a place for trafficked youth to be able to live temporarily while these things are being sorted out. And so that's why we've taken it upon ourselves with the board of directors and myself to strategically plan to build a trafficked youth facility, which I'm thankful and grateful to say is going to be turning dirt here, but in about June or July, we're going to be starting the building process. So we're just thrilled to be able to build an 8-bed facility to help house some of those youth who could have been, runaways or ran away from home for whatever reason. But they just need a place to stay once they've been rescued. And our task force, and we just were not aware that we were going to find so many youth, so many minors. No one anticipated that when we started the task force. And when that started and the uptick, we started seeing youth, we said, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. So Samaritan House, again, retooled itself and said, we're going to fill that gap. We're going to build a youth facility. So that's what we're doing right now. That's our biggest project, our most recent project happening.
Well, that will be a blessing to those people that are able to
Yes.
take advantage of that facility. And it struck me when you and I first spoke a few weeks ago that the terminology, trafficking, I think in many minds in America, they think of trafficking as something that happens, in third world countries. And I don't think there's maybe all that great of an awareness about the extent of it here in this country. And,
Absolutely.
what I was reading was that, 71% of it, but it's hard to pinpoint numbers in this area because, it's a moving target and so much is undiscovered. So a lot of these are just approximations, but from those that they've been able to identify, they said it's disproportionately female, and highly disproportionate representation
Domestic.
from the minority communities. It's what they often said were marginalized communities,
Yeah.
because we talked about kids that were in the system. It's not all just kids, but one of the points that I was reading about was that if kids are in the system, the reason they're so vulnerable is because oftentimes the caseworkers are overloaded, or the files are being shifted from caseworker to caseworker and creating the potential for the kids to slide through gaps. And then foster families, maybe that's not true here in Virginia Beach, but in some larger cities, there's too many kids being watched by too few, and there's just so
Yeah.
many opportunities for kids to fall through the cracks, and the traffickers know where to find these kids and how to attract them and how to lure them in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, kids are vulnerable for a lot of reasons. You did a great job describing many of those reasons. And we're finding that, to be true. But it's just sad in this day and age that people are trafficking their children, or children are so vulnerable that they're being preyed upon by these traffickers. And it's gone on for a long time, but we're just now seeing it because there's money being, funneled to nonprofits and to task forces and to police forces and things like that, so that we can look at it and we can find these victims. But it has probably been around longer than any of us are willing to admit, or even, your brain protects you from things that you really don't want to believe because it's just so awful. And so, yeah, it's devastating to hear the stories of what we hear. And it's to the point that, we have to bring in, a therapist for our own staff to help manage what they hear on a day-to-day basis.
I was going to ask you about that because, all the years you've been there, I mean, and then all of your staff, and it has to take a toll.
It
I mean,
does.
you're just not a human being if tragedy doesn't affect you.
Yes, yes. But back to your question, the majority of the trafficking that we have seen is domestic trafficking. It's happening here at home. It is not with foreign nationals. We do have 5% foreign nationals, but typically it's domestic sex trafficking with girls. But that is because that's where our task force was looking, right? The hotel and motel industry, where they're getting tips and tip lines. But our task force is now going to be looking at labor trafficking a little bit more, and looking in the agricultural areas, and looking and following tips on construction sites where there's unpaid labor. So, it's often you will find what you're looking for. And so right now, the majority of the trafficking that we've seen since 2017 is domestic trafficking with girls, with young women here at home. And we kind of thought maybe the pandemic would prevent maybe some sex work from happening, and maybe the Johns would not want to buy sex because of the pandemic, and they'd be afraid of COVID, but that didn't seem to happen, unfortunately. A lot of women were moved from New York when New York shut down early on. A lot of girls and women were brought here by traffickers in our own hotels and motels. And so all kinds of things can happen because of a pandemic, but we really didn't expect there to be an uptick in human trafficking as well, and not an uptick in trafficking children. So it's been devastating, but at the same time, if you this is God's work, and I'm glad that Samaritan House is here and we're doing this work, because it's not for everybody, and everybody can't do it. And so our staff are specially trained, specially supported, and a lot goes into, when you get federal funding, a lot of things, a lot of I's you have to dot and a lot of T's you have to cross, and a lot of training you have to get. So I'm just happy that we're here and we're doing the work, and someone's got to do it. It's tough work, but someone's got to do it.
When you and I first talked, I want to try to be as vague as possible to protect, people's
Yes.
anonymity. But a friend of a friend had a daughter that kind of experienced what you were discussing, and I guess there was maybe some fighting between parent and child, which is not
Yeah.
atypical in any family, but teenagers are
Yeah.
rebellious. But the disturbing thing that it was basic middle class family, and when they did locate her, it was through a friend who called her mom, I think is what happened. And turned out she was in a motel with two men. They had drugged
Yeah.
her up. They had convinced her that she's more valuable, that they love her more than her parents do, and they manipulated her. And it connected me with this article that I had read, that the traffickers often use the same kind of psychological manipulation on kids, not just minors, but young
Yeah.
people, that that physical abusive people often use. It's that
Yes.
that putting the guilt on the victim rather than the other way around. And and things
Yeah.
like you're giving it away for free, so why don't you make some money, appealing to whatever they find is the driver, and how they can suck them in.
Absolutely.
These are
I mean, we're seeing the traffickers using puppies right now. They'll get a victim, a young woman, young girl, a puppy, and she'll fall in love with that puppy. And then it won't be long where they'll threaten to kill or take away that puppy if you don't meet the quota, the sex quota, or the sex work quota that they have for that day or that week. And so appealing to anything, whether it be pets or money or special bags or special attention or even nice clothes and nice shoes. I mean, they'll appeal to anything for a vulnerable youth. But we're seeing that pets work really, really well with young girls. And so, we even had to design a pet shelter in one of our shelters so that, a victim who maybe the pimp or the trafficker is arrested, but they can't go anywhere with a pet. And so, we're saying you can come here and you can bring your pet too. So you don't have to make that decision of, am I going to lose my pet? Is it going to go to the SPCA? Are they going to adopt it or destroy it? Or, and they don't. They have great programs at the SPCAs, but, some of these victims just don't trust that that's going to happen, even though they sign paperwork. So you can bring your cat, you can bring your dog, your puppy, your fish, your mice, you can bring anything you want to one of our shelters that's accommodating to pets. And so we had to design that specifically because of all victims, but specifically because of the human trafficking. I was coming into work and one day there was a puppy in my office and the next day there was a dog in the office and a cat. And I'm like, this has got to stop, But who the heck wants to say no to a victim because they got a pet? So of course we're going to take them. But our offices were becoming little, animal shelters. So I said, we've got to do something about that and build a shelter. And thank God to the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, to the Red Rover Foundation that gave us these great grants to, convert one of our shelters to a pet shelter. And the pets have a side to be on, but you can also bring the pet to your bedroom and all the walls are waterproof and the floors are waterproof. And it's a beautiful facility. So, but these are the types of services you have to have when you have those vulnerabilities with people that, really need their pets for emotional support animals, whether it's therapeutic or just a pet. You need to be prepared for that because traffickers will use anything they can to get into the minds of these young women and young girls. And there's a bond that happens between the trafficker and the pimp. And just like you were saying, this whole manipulation is, well, no one cares about you, but I'm putting you up in a hotel, I'm paying for this, and I'm feeding you, and I'm getting you all these nice clothes, and I'm getting you this jewelry, and I'm paying for all this stuff. And then guess what? You owe me. And that's how it happens,
Yeah, I was reading that, there are, where are my notes here? That they noticed 4 different areas that there was debt bondage where
Yep.
they which I often heard was how with people escaping from different
Foreign countries.
Usually
Yes.
An oppressive country, they say, well, we can get you out and get you to America, and then it's like,
you owe us.
well, yeah, now you have a $10,000 debt you have to work off, and that's how they keep. And then and then there's there's the domestic servitude, there's the forced child labor, which is separate from the sex trafficking and child sex trafficking. And so I mean, all these different scenarios, so they all play different games, I'm sure, but I'm sure some of them overlap.
Yeah. And, to meet that threshold of human trafficking is, what you have to do is prove some sort of force, fraud, or coercion has happened, right? So for prostitution, people sometimes get that mixed up with human trafficking, and prostitution is illegal. But, people that prostitute keep their own money. They choose when and where and who. And that is very different from human trafficking, where you are forced to do it, coerced to do it in some way. And that's where the statute lies, where it's different between prostitution and human trafficking. There has to be a trafficker, a pimp, or an oppressor that forces you to do it, whether it's by gunpoint or by manipulation or coercion. And often they will use drugs and alcohol to get these victims, these survivors, dependent on them, and then they will use that for coercion. If someone maybe is not as agreeable to sex work, and so they dope them up, or they get them drunk, or they get them high, and then they force them to do it, and then it starts to become, something that happens all the time, and it's connected to the drugs or to the alcohol. And so, they have lots of tricks up their sleeve. Very, very tricky manipulation, and then this trauma bond that happens between the pimp or the trafficker. Often a pimp will just befriend someone online, a young girl, or even at high school, someone who they will befriend them and become their boyfriend and girlfriend, and they treat them really, really wonderful. And then, months and months into it, they start to flip and they start saying, well, now you have to start having sex with a friend of mine or a relative or this or that. And lots of different manipulation techniques
That is
is
that what's
used.
referred to as the grooming process?
Yes, yes, the grooming process. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely, we've seen some girls be manipulated into someone saying, I'm going to help you become a model. And so I'm going to take you to this modeling agency. And it starts out with taking pictures, and then it becomes exploitation, and then it becomes pornography, and then it becomes trafficking. I mean, any type of manipulation like that, it's, they're just preyed upon. And yeah, any vulnerable population is preyed upon, but specifically for young girls and young women in trafficking, we see the African American group to be preyed upon, more heavily than white, and that happens in many of the victimizations. African American women are disproportionately killed at a greater rate from domestic violence than any other race. And I just attended a funeral for two Black women, a mother and a daughter. Alicia Herford was killed by her daughter's abuser, and he killed his girlfriend, which was Alicia's daughter, and Alicia on the same day. And she was a previous employee of Samaritan House for 6 months.
Oh no.
And it's so sad that disproportionately Black women get killed over white women. And frankly, here at Samaritan House, we've had enough of that. And I've done several news stories on it. And it's time for leaders to get, a moral compass and say, why are Black women disproportionately being killed? And what are we going to do about that? I mean, abuse is bad. Abuse is hard, but most women survive abuse. They survive for many, many, many years. It could be black eyes, it could be broken limbs, it could be burns and cuts. But Black women die. And so, when a life is taken, it's permanent. And it's time for us to start looking at that. And we knew about this years and years and years ago, before Black Lives Matter, before the protests, before all of this. We knew by research that has been done, disproportionately Black women are killed. And so unfortunately, that came very close to home here recently, very close to home. And I wish and hope the leaders, we could come together and really look at that issue and make some progress.
In my doing a little research before you and I talked, looking into human trafficking, just as you dive into reading and looking at videos and all that, it always leads you to kind of the prostitution discussion. Yes. It's not always connected, but often can be. And
yes.
And one of the things and it made me think, I mean, morally, I can't defend prostitution, but there was this discussion about, well, what's the most effective way to go after it? And I think it was Seattle. They were adopting what's called the Nordic model, and whereby the laws were changed to more or less make prostitution, the selling, legal, but the buying and the distribution, so the Johns and the pimps, that was the illegal. So they're going after the supply or the demand rather than the supply.
Yes.
And then the traffickers or pimps. And they started seeing a lot of really good results. And there was an interview, this woman who was doing this special, I saw a 3-part special on, and she was interviewing a couple of advocates and active prostitutes. And, she said, well, why is it important that the actual act of prostitution is legal versus the others? Because, most people are not proponents of prostitution, so why should we legalize it? And they said, oftentimes the women come to this occupation out of necessity or a
Yeah.
variety of different circumstances, and
Yeah.
they are so at risk
Yeah.
for their lives, kind of what you were saying, but different circumstances, because, if a John were to rough them up or, God forbid, kill them,
Yeah.
there's not any active, let's stay away from killing because that creates a whole different path. But, let's say, that a John beats up a prostitute. The prostitute's not going to feel comfortable going to the police to report it because she would
Right.
have to admit she was doing
She's
something
doing an
illegal.
illegal act. Correct.
But by removing that barrier, not only do the women have a little protection of their own, they can report it, but it also
Yes.
is kind of a way of, for the Johns and the pimps to be on guard that they're the
Yeah.
target
Yeah.
rather than the prostitute. So it kind of flips the script on them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great model program. And, many progressive states and progressive cities have things like that, or they have prostitution court where it's more of a diversion instead of a prosecution, but to divert you to a program that'll help you find another way to earn income. Because, for the most part, prostitutes don't really want to do it. They find that that's the only way that they can earn income for whatever reason. A lot of them were sexually molested as a child, or were, and all kinds of things lead up to someone feeling like they need to become a prostitute or sell sex because that's the only way that they can survive financially. So that model, and there's lots of models similar to that, is great. And I wish we had that in this area as well. And maybe we will someday, but a lot of progressive
The
cities.
police that were interviewed, they were even advocates for this change.
Yes.
Because they're like, all we're doing when it was the other way, we were booking these girls. They were getting, maybe overnight in jail. They do it, they post a bond and they're
Fine.
out, and it was a revolving door, and
They
it
weren't
never
getting help.
changed.
Yeah.
I mean, because you're not going after the guys who are buying prostitutes and the guys that are
Right.
pimping them.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great model. And I wish, maybe at some point, we would be able to help more with prostitutes as well, because we totally believe they're victims. There's no question about that prostitutes are victims and victimized as well. But unfortunately, our grant limits us to the human trafficking piece here. And there are other great programs that have, prostitution programs to help people make a change, or, restorative programs for prostitutes. But we're mainly focused at Samaritan House on those victims that forced fraud or coercion is occurring, federal cases and local cases where they're working with the police. Because, when we can work with a victim and help them become secure enough that they can testify in these cases against the trafficker and the pimp, it really gets these guys, off the street. And we've been pretty successful at getting a lot of prosecutions out of this task force. And so it's never something that they have to do, but when the police and the courts and victim service providers work together and provide a victim service approach, a victim-centered approach, you're more likely to get a victim to also help with the prosecution. And so, our goal is not only helping the victims, but to get the perpetrators arrested and off the street and into jail. And so I can say this approach really works when you have a task force working together with a victim service program. And so it's just been a real success for what we've gotten thus far, with the task force.
So regarding children, or at least minors,
Yes.
that are trafficked, and with the scenario that, they've come to your attention, which means something that, there's a prosecution or there's something going on. So
Yeah.
what happens with these kids? Like, let's not even get into the late teens, because I'm assuming they're gonna age out at 18, right? And probably fall into
So if they're 18, they can actually live with us and get all of our services. But if they're under 18, there are so few facilities that are out there to help children. You know, if they have a substance abuse issue or a severe mental health issue, or severely disabled, there are, you know, temporary hospitals or institutions or programs where they can go to temporarily. But when they get out, there is no step down place for a trafficked youth. And so that's what our program is going to be there for. It's called the Halos, and it's on some church property in Virginia Beach. And so, you know, there just isn't there isn't a program out there in this state. Often when we're faced with a youth and CPS is involved or maybe not involved, there's a placement issue. And, you know, there's runaway shelters that can help, but they're temporary. They're not trauma informed. They don't have the services that a kid who's been victimized for a long time, you know, really needs. And so there's just a big gap. A lot of times law enforcement will put them in juvenile detention because at least they're off the street and they're safe. And, you know, it's difficult to think that a victim has to go to juvenile detention, but if there's no other place, at least they're safe from being trafficked again and relocated out of the area, relocated out of the state. So as much as I say it's a detriment to put them in juvenile detention, if there's no other place, I'd rather see them there than on the street being pimped out, or, you know, with a trafficker moving them, because traffickers move their victims from place to place to place. That's how they stay away from being caught. If they're just there for the weekend or a week, or, you know, we've seen many of victims that have been in, you know, 100 different zip codes in the last 6 months and just moved and moved and moved. And, you know, that's one of the things.
So that's something new to me. So traffickers will not necessarily stay where they have trafficked the child. They'll go on a road show, if you will, to.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then how?
Because what happens is when you're in a hotel and motel or a bit or a place that you're trafficking your victim, a lot of men, typically men, because sometimes there's women perpetrators and male victims, you know, male child prostitutes, and I mean male victims that have been forced to prostitute. You'll see a lot of people going in and out of a house or in and out of a hotel, or it could be a campground, it could be a beach, it could be, I mean, anywhere, but there'll be a lot of attention coming because there's a lot of people entering and leaving in a short amount of time. So by the time that gets reported and someone investigates and they're gone, because they know as soon as someone picks up on the fact that there's a lot of traffic going in and out. It's sort of like when you know in your neighborhood someone's selling drugs or someone is doing something they shouldn't be, you know, it attracts attention after a while. So one of the best things that they do to avoid, you know, being picked up or to avoid the police is to move. So they may take their victims and separate them in different hotels and motels, and then pick them up and then move to another city and separate them in different motels, hotels. And they travel to big events. They travel to the Super Bowl events. They travel to political events where there's a lot of men, a lot of buyers of sex. And so they will physically, you know, move their children or move their victims to special events where they can sell them.
I've heard that, you know, it seems that every year for the Super Bowl and some other big events,
someone gets picked up for something.
Well, the local news always seems to kind of cover that, you know, they're ramping up because there always is a influx of prostitution around these events. And
yes.
You know, I was going to ask, you know, how does or how could the faith community be of support? But, you know, the more I think about it, and the more I hear from you and read that, you know, it requires such specialty to deal in this, that, I mean, while spiritual and emotional support is always good for everybody, and I guess that's maybe the role is, you know, alongside to give that spiritual and emotional support, you know, the expertise that's required to do anything beyond that, I think might be outside the grasp of most congregations.
Yeah, but, you know, there's lots of things that churches and synagogues and places of worship and faith communities can do. and, support the staff that do this work. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of expertise to, help a program and come in and bring, provide lunch for staff, or provide breakfast for staff, or, help the workers that are doing the work. It's just one simple thing that any group can do. But we need clothing and
Yeah,
items for our
I meant
victims.
I meant
They
beyond
could do that type of thing.
financial or
Yeah.
donations. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Donations and helping staff and things like that. So there's plenty of room for church groups. We just had a church group because we've had so many people in hotels and motels. All they did was put quarters in bags and put a ribbon around them. And we brought quarters so that our victims in hotels could wash their laundry. I mean, it was like a significant thing. Like,
Yeah.
if they weren't employed and we're putting them in the hotel, we can't afford to feed them and give them quarters for their laundry and give them money to use the phone. I mean, it's expensive, $158,000 thus far. And so we've had a group that helps with quarters for the laundry or bags of groceries. And so there's so many things you can do to help, but you're right, that one-to-one relationship with the victim takes specialty. And even the counseling that we have here has to be licensed counseling and therapeutic interventions that have to be done with a very special lens.
But you did bring up something, like the armed services, the fire departments, the police departments, they all have chaplaincies. They have chaplains, and if nobody's doing it, a roving chaplain that goes out and gives spiritual support to the people that are doing the work that you guys are doing.
My husband's a police chaplain. He volunteers his time. Yeah. And so, that's an absolute wonderful idea. As a matter of fact, I'll bring it up to him. I think that's a great idea. Any support you can give the staff or anyone else who's in the, in this network of helping victims, whether it be the police or the victim service providers or anyone who's in that network, we can all really appreciate the spiritual support and the emotional support and anything that anybody can do is really helpful. I just got a card this morning actually from someone that had some spiritual support in it, and it just made my day. I mean, it was just a simple card, but I opened it up and I was like, wow, they really appreciated something that I had done. And so those kind of things can really lighten a load or bring a lift to staff that are doing this heavy emotional work.
Yeah, I mean, we think of these chaplains, doing work and I omitted hospitals, but the common thread is that a lot of these people in these professions are dealing with oftentimes very dark things and tragedy. And so it can be very easy to fall into depression and fall into, despair and lose faith and not see, the brightness amongst the clouds, if you will. And so the way you're describing your work and the people that work with you, they're no different. I mean, they're seeing human tragedy, even with the success stories that come about, but on the intake side, if you will, they're seeing some really traumatic things with people that have experienced, horrendous things leading up to, the first time you meet them.
Horrendous things. Yeah. And I akin it to war criminals. And when you hear war stories about torture, that's what I think of when I think about what our staff are hearing on a daily basis. It's like torture in some cases, and that does work on the psyche after a while.
To move to a little bit brighter side, why don't we talk about some success stories? Brag on a few of your success stories, because I'm sure there are some.
Yeah. And, we can't release any personally identifying information. So I can't use names. I can't use, anything like that. We're really protective, between federal law and state law. We have confidentiality programs where we cannot, without the person's permission, share any information about them. So, but yes, we've had lots of stories of people that are now thriving because they've been to our program. I think of one that comes to mind all the time, who was in juvenile, a young girl that was in juvenile detention, and our youth case manager was coming to juvenile detention to meet with one of the victims, one of the minors of trafficking, and she said to her, well, who's that? Who comes to visit you every week? They're so nice. Like, who is that person? Do you know them? Is it a family member? And so she told her exactly who this case manager was and what they were doing. And she's like, oh my goodness, I'm a victim of that too. And this is my story. And so she ended up forming a relationship with that youth case manager. And when she left juvenile detention, she came to Samaritan House once she left juvenile detention because she had no place to go. She kind of aged out. She turned 18. She was no longer eligible. But because she did have the background of being a trafficked minor, she came to Samaritan House. And it was just an amazing story. She was one of those that were an online inquiry about you're so beautiful. I love that picture of you online. I think you should be a model. And has anyone ever asked you if you wanted to be a model? And so she formed a very brief, quick relationship with a stranger online, and ended up, because she was a vulnerable youth and her parents one had passed away and one was a drug addict, he moved her to California to say she was going to be a model in LA and blah, 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 and end up trafficking her. And she had to make her way back to this area as a youth, and ended up in juvenile detention. And so she ended up coming to Samaritan House, and now she's a beautiful young woman going to college, working full time, supporting herself. And so, we often use her story as one when we talk about successes. And she's given permission and has often does some promotional things, for us. I apologize, it did not shut my phones up. And so, stories like that.
Good work. You're in need.
I know. So, stories like that happen often. The majority of our victims, because we have such comprehensive services, from medical to dental to therapeutic to work development and housing, we have a comprehensive rapid rehousing program. Anyone who leaves Samaritan House that wants to be rehoused into their own apartment can get first month's rent and deposit in a housing stabilization advocate that will work beside you while you're renting your own place, and they will help find a place for you. And we know landlords and property managers that will work with vulnerable populations, and we assist with that rent for several months, if not 6 months or longer, until you get full-time employment where you can pay for it on your own. And so, because these services are so comprehensive, anyone who really wants to be successful and thrive and be self-sufficient, you can do that here. We have so many steps, in our program. And so we have lots of stories like that. But that was just one in particular that really shows how the trafficker manipulates, the trafficking victim. And she was not as vulnerable as some other victims. She was actually living with her grandmother and had access to the internet and had, food, clothes, and everything she needed. But she was manipulated, as a teenager. And that's the kind of thing that can happen.
Yeah. Well, that is a wonderful story, and exactly what I was hoping. I'm sure that not every outcome is that great. There's probably, a very wide spectrum of outcomes,
Yes.
From continued tragedy to the one you just described, and
Yes.
everything in between. But, I think probably the most important thing is that, like you said, through the comprehensive services that you're able to offer, you're at least giving them a fighting chance at starting a new life and seeing what's possible. And,
yes. Yes. I often say we have
your words, that is God's work. So
it is. We got to give people hope, that they're capable of doing something else. If you can give them hope, then they can probably do anything, but they got to have that hope.
Well, I mean, that's the basis of my whole faith is
yes,
that concept of hope and
mine as well.
So to the extent that we understand what that is, as we can instill that in others, that, tomorrow is not necessarily going to be as bad as today or yesterday.
Right.
It lifts the spirit, but you have to look up, and you have to have
Yes.
something that, gives
Yes.
you hope outside of yourself, something
That's right.
bigger. Yeah.
That's right.
So our time is coming to an end, and what I'd like to do and give you the opportunity is to take a minute or two and share whatever's on your heart or mind about the world in general, about Samaritan House, about the problems you face, whatever that may be. I turn the microphone over to you to share whatever you wish.
Sure. I just want the world to know our hotline number. So 757-430-2120. If you are in a situation of precarious housing, if someone's forcing you to do something that you don't want to do sexually, if someone is hurting you, please call our hotline. We can tell you all about the services we have. You don't have to give your name. You don't have to agree to do anything. Just ask someone what's out there, what's available to me. You don't have to use a shelter. You don't have to be a woman. A lot of people think these services are only eligible to women. They are not. Just reach out and talk to someone and decide, hey, is this something that can help you in whatever your situation is? Can it help you or not? Just give us a chance, because, if people don't know you're out there, they continue to go down the same path because they just don't know there's anyone out there that cares and that can help. And so we're here. We've been in the community for 35 years. We're here to help, and we'll continue to grow our services to whatever need there is in the community, because I think that's what nonprofits are called to do. So we're here, and if you need us, please call 430-2120.
That's great. Even though I'm a fledgling YouTube channel, and I deeply appreciate you taking this time to spend with us. Hopefully the channel will grow, and hopefully as many people as possible can see this. And, my hope for the channel is by talking to people like yourself that, it builds awareness in people about all these different subjects, and that maybe one person will get that phone number and make a call.
Yes.
And change their life. So
it can happen. It can happen, and it will.
So let's hope one person gets saved because of our discussion
Yeah,
today.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I guarantee it will, Richard. I guarantee it. I see it every day.
Well, God bless you in the work you're doing. And
thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. I hope very soon, with the end of COVID, that we'll be able to meet in person soon.
Yes, sounds great.
Okay. Well, thanks again.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.